All right, Shabbosai, good morning. Let us begin. Begin by thanking all of our wonderful sponsors. To thank our TALMUD TORAH sponsors for the month of Tishrei. Dr. Linda Weinberg, Sarah and Ricky Gratz, Julia, Rena, E and Eve, in loving memory of their husband, father, and Zayda. Dr. Paul Weinberg, Paris, Moshe Ben Avraham, David. To thank Ayal and Sara Steinberg for dedicating the shurim this month in the zechus of Refuah Sheleima for shulamis, shulamis bas susha, Adler and Yudit Ben Zev for dedicating all the shurim and drashos this month in the zechus of our tefillos being miskabel. Our week of learning sponsors, Saeed and Sima Haken for the Refuah Sheleima of their granddaughter, Talia, Miriam, Bas, Orli, Yehudit, Greg and Rachel Levitan, in commemoration of the first yahrzeit of Greg's mother, Esther Levitan, Esther Bas Herschel, and in gratitude and in honor of Renewal, an organization which facilitates kidney transplants. Daf Yomi sponsors for today, Nathan and Beth Adler, in memory of Nathan's grandfather, Morenu Ben Pinchas Zichron Livracha. The Meirowitz family in memory of Avraham Meirowitz, Basha Meirowitz, Mordechai Meirowitz, Fega Meirowitz, Hirsch Meirowitz, and Yitzchak Meirowitz Zichronim Livracha. We hope that in the merit of our TALMUD TORAH, all of the neshamas will have an aliyah. The families of Nechama, all of those who require a refuah, should have one together with Kol Cholei Yisrael. So let's with that, let us begin. So we have a lot to do today. Today's daf is daf Tzadik 90. We are picking up on Pei Tessim Base 89b, and we are picking up 14 lines up from the bottom. So the Gemara says as follows: The Ella miditane b'chibar adam. So let's remember again. The Gemara was taking it for granted that an arusa has a ksuva. So now we're trying to figure out from where do we know that an arusa has a ksuva? To which the Gemara says, rather, it must come from the following statement of Rav Chia bar Avin. So the Gemara says, what is the He says, Ishto arusa. If a man has a wife who's an arusa, in other words, he's in the innocent state of marriage. So lo'onein v'lo metamela. So ultimately, again, there's no anios for her. If he's a Kohen, ultimately he does not become tummy for her. So too she does not become an onenes for him, nor does she become tummy for him. Mesa, if she dies, Eina Yarsha, he does not inherit her. Meshu, if he dies, Gove Ksuvasa. Ultimately she collects her ksuva. Shabbos said this is a pretty explicit statement here, indicating that what? That even a woman from Erisin has a ksuva. To which the Gemara says, well, maybe not. Deal with the cost of law. Maybe like we said yesterday, maybe this is talking about a case of a man who willingly committed himself to a ksuva. In other words, maybe the default is that you don't have a ksuva from Erisin, but if halacha l'maisa, you willingly commit yourself, then of course you do have a ksuva. Maybe I'll say, but one second, if we're talking about a case of willful commitment, right, that he's going out of his way to willfully commit himself to a ksuva, then of course she has a ksuva. I'll say, like I said yesterday, no different than any other time you willfully commit yourself financially to someone else. You're committed. To which the Gemara says, Mesa ini yarshet shrichale. You would still need the statement ultimately again that if she dies, he does not inherit her. Okay, so therefore halacha l'maisa, the Gemara still does not seem to have a conclusive proof as to where we know that Narusa has a ksuva. Amar Rav Nachman Rafuna. The Rav da Amar get go ve'ikr. Supposed to remember again, going back to yesterday's daf, Rav had an interesting model that if a woman shows up with a get, the get allows her to collect ikr ksuva. If she shows up with the ksuva allows her to collect tosefes. So the Rav da Amar get go ve'ikr lechosh dilma mafka gita b'hai beidina the gavya v'hadra mafka b'hai beidina achrina the gavya. So we'll say, according to Rav, who says the woman could collect ikr ksuva with a get, aren't we concerned about the possibility that what? She's going to produce her get here, collect ikr ksuva, and then what? Produce her get somewhere else and collect again. Aren't we concerned about? To which the Gemara says, maybe there's a simple answer. The first time that the woman presents her get and she collects, what do we do with the get afterwards? What do we do with it? We rip it up. Rip it up. You can't rip up a get. Why not? So she says, I need that get. Why do I need that get? That get is my license to remarry. The Gemara says, maybe, the kasvinon agabe Agabe Gita, to which Sara says, Amra ba'ina la'an subebe. So the Karina, so ultimately again, she says, I needed to go in and get remarried. To which the Gemara says, the Karina le the kasvina agabe Gita danan karan inhu lab mishum de Gita. So to which the Gemara says, you're right. Instead, what do? We rip the get, now not rip it up into pieces, but rather we make a rip in the get, and we write the following message on the body of the get itself. The reason we have ripped this get, again, not ripped it up because you can still be able to read it, so she could still use it as a raya to get remarried, and we write on it. The reason we ripped this get is not because the get is invalid. La mishum de gita pasal ella delot yehadar v'tigbi bei zimna achrina. Rather, the reason we're going and ripping it is so why? Is that she should not use it to collect a second time. So we'll say, so interesting. So in other words, essentially, the get itself kind of becomes the receipt, right? Becomes the shover. And again, the text on the get, we make a little rip. That way everyone sees that it's different. Put a message on it. And this way cannot be used to go ahead and collect multiple times. I will say, just in terms of the ksuva from Erisin, so remember again, we saw the Rambam Paskins, that halacha l'maisa, there is no ksuva from Erisin. Like, ksuva only goes into effect on nisuin, unless of course what? A husband chooses to commit himself, right? In other words, if a husband chooses to commit himself to a ksuva as of Erisin, of course that is permitted, that can be done, but halacha l'maisa, there is no t'nai bezdin of a ksuva, except from nisuin. Incredible. Mishnah, bottom of 89b, Peitas on the base. Shnei gittin shnei ksuvas. So we'll say a very interesting case. Let's say a woman produces 2 gittin and 2 ksuvas. And I will say now, why would one be producing 2 gittin and 2 ksuvas? It's actually not such a complicated case. Reuben was married to Rachel, right? So she has a ksuva from her marriage. Then what happens? They got divorced. Okay, now what happened? Then what happens? They got remarried. So now again, Reuven wrote a second ksuva for their second marriage. You know, there's an after. He wrote a second ksuva for the second marriage. And then what happened? Didn't work out again, right? She's second get. So now she shows up to Beis Din with 2 gittin and 2 ksuvas. So what's talach in such a situation? Govish, take ksuvas. So she collects twice. Again, she collects twice. Two different ksuva obligations. So she collects twice. Good. She takes ksuvas for get echad. So what happens if she has 2 ksuvas and 1 get? 2 ksuvas and 1 get, right? Or ksuva ushne gittin, or 1 ksuva and 2 gittin. Now take a look at Rashi for just a moment. Rashi says over here, shtei ksuvas v'get. It's in the wide lines of Rashi, about 4 lines in. Shnei ksuvas v'get. Shekidmu shteihen leget. Now what we're going to see in this case, what we talk about over here is, interestingly enough, both of these ksuvas, the dates in these ksuvas precede the get. So she has two ksuvas with 2 different dates which precede the get. Or ksuva shnei gittin, or she has 1 ksuva, 2 gittin, right? O ksuva v'get umisa, or what else is interesting? She has a ksuva, a get, and a dead husband, right? Right? What's the halach in all of these cases? Eino gova ela ksuva achos. Ultimately, again, she only collects 1 ksuva. Why I will say? Shamegarish es ishto vechzira almanas ksuva harishona machzira. We've actually seen this concept before. Because there is such a concept in halacha that when a man divorces his wife and then remarries her, he doesn't have to write the new ksuva. Now he can write the new ksuva if he wants to, but lamaisa he could also just as easily rely on the original ksuva. So let's analyze this. So which the Gemara says, Ibai bahai gavya. So if you take a look at Rashi in the Gemara, Ibai bahai gavya bitmiya vashtei ksuvos v'get kai. Now I will say, Rashi's now focused. The Gemara is now focused on the following case. A woman shows up to Beis Din with 2 ksuvas and a get. 2 ksuvas and a get. So just to illustrate what's happening over here. She has 2 ksuvas with 2 different dates, and a get. So I will say, so now, remember, how many ksuvas could she collect? Only 1. But what's interesting is, the Mishnah makes it sound like, which one could she use to collect? Which one could she use? Either one. To which the Gemara said, really? So, Ibai b'hai gavyo, Lema Tevit of Rav Nachman Amar Shmuel. This refutes Rav Nachman Amar Shmuel. What is the Amar Rav Nachman Amar Shmuel? Shtei shtaras hayotzim b'za'achar zeh. I will say in general. Now in halacha you could have this often, where you could have 2 documents. What happens if you have 2 documents which seem to really be focusing on the same transaction, but they come out at 2 different dates? come out of two different dates. What's the halacha? So the Gemara says, so bital sheni esarishon. In general, when we seem to have two duplicative documents with two different dates, what generally happens is the second one overrides the first. We've actually seen this halacha before. The second overrides the first. So Rabbi says, I don't understand, we should apply the same concept over here in this case as well. Namely that halacha l'maisa, the second ksuva, should go ahead and essentially cancel out the first. Lav itmar, didn't we say about this? Amra Papa, umod Rav Nachman, the osif beidikla l'tosefes kasvei. So Rabbi said, there's one exception to this rule. What's the one exception to this rule? If the second shtar adds in something over the first. So Rabbi says, so in other words, there are two cases of two shtaros. So case number one is where these two shtaros say the same thing. If that's the case, I will say, then what happens? We assume the second one is the primary one and it cancels the first. I will say, you'll say to yourself, who cares? If it's the same shtar, what does it matter if you use the first one or the second one? It matters a lot, because what matters? I will say they're dated two different dates, which means the first one has an earlier lien, the second one has a later lien. So therefore, if they're saying the same information, we go with the second one with the later lien. There's an exception. If the second document adds in more than the first. So I will say, let's analyze this with ksuva for just a moment, because this is really interesting, right? So Rachel produces two ksuvas, right? One dated the first of Av, and one dated the first of Elul. Now I will say, this first of Elul, the second one, includes, Rashi said, Gemara says where, another palm tree, right? In other words, an additional amount of money, or an additional value. So I will say, essentially the way we interpret these two stars are like this. What Reuven is essentially saying to Rachel is, here's the deal. You could take the document with the earlier lien, the ksuva with the earlier lien, but that ksuva is worth less. Or you could take the ksuva with the later lien with a higher face value. Now, from Reuven's perspective, what is he trying to do? He's trying to sweeten the deal for her to take the ksuva with the later lien. Right, because he's interested in selling off, possibly, what he's interested in doing is selling off unencumbered property from the earlier date. So he's willing to pay her more money in the ksuva for her to accept a later lien date on the ksuva. To which the Gemara says, "Hakanami b'da osifla." So therefore, again, I will say, when the Mishnah says that she's producing a get and two ksuvas, it must be that the case over here is they're not duplicative ksuvas. There are two ksuvas dated at two different dates, and the second one includes something additional that the first did not. Now, who determines which ksuva goes into effect? Who determines that? Rachel. She could decide earlier lien, like smaller face value, lesser face value, or ultimately, again, later lien, greater face value. That's up to her. Fascinating. Hotzia get to ksuvas uksuva umisa. So also the Brisa said that if halacha l'maisa, what happened? So we'll say she goes ahead and produces a get and a ksuva, and now her husband passed away. So what's the halacha? Top of tzaddik, im get kodem l'ksuva, so go v'shtei ksuvas. So we'll say if her get was before the ksuva, then what we assume happened over here is what? So right, if the get comes before the ksuva, then ultimately again she went ahead and she has two ksuvas, one from before her divorce, one from after her widowhood, right? The Gemara says ksuva kodemes leget, but if the ksuva came before the get, ksuva was dated before the get, ena gova el ksuva achos. Ultimately, again, she only gets one ksuva. Why? Shemegarish ishto ve'echzira, because we'll say if a man divorces his wife and then remarries her, amanas ksuva harishona hechzira. He doesn't have to necessarily draft a new ksuva, but rather again he could remarry her on the basis of the first ksuva. Now again, I want to point out, a man remarrying his wife on the basis of her first ksuva, remember, does something very interesting, which is there's a lien which predates the marriage, which is quite fascinating, right? So, right, Reuven's married to Rachel, they divorce. So technically, you're supposed to say, so right, what's the process? The process is you give a get. What's next step? Pay out the ksuva. Okay, then what's next step? I guess another first date, right? They go ahead, right, get reacquainted, go to the therapist a little bit, right, and they come back, Baruch Hashem, get remarried. Now, what should happen? New ksuva. So there's a concept in halacha that exists, that if he has not yet paid out the ksuva, and they decide to remarry, then halacha l'maisa, he could use the first ksuva. So to us, that sounds, wow, that's so convenient. What I will just, right, we never even took it down from the wall, right? It's still hanging in the living room. So this is fantastic. We could still go ahead and use it. I just want to point out that could be financially disadvantageous to the husband because now you have a lien on property, which actually precedes the date of the marriage. So again, the point the Gemara is making is if the husband wants to do it for convenience sake, you can do it. Although financially, it just creates a lien which pre-exists the marriage. Okay, fascinating. Mishnah, we'll say really interesting case. Katan she'esiu aviv. So we'll say this is a case of a minor son, right? A boy who is below the age of bar mitzvah, whose father enters him into marriage. Then I will say, what is the status of marriage to a katan? What's the status of the marriage? Nothing. Now, here's what's fascinating over here. But the father married him off. Okay, so the son got married. And what happens? Ksuvasa kayemes, sha'amanas kin kaima. Then I will say, now the case over here is that halacha l'maisa. Then the son grew up. Now, when the son got married, so he wrote a ksuva for his wife. He wrote a ksuva. Now again, we'll see the Rambam has a little bit of a different gears on this. But ultimately, again, the son writes a ksuva for his wife. Now what happens? He reaches the age, right? He becomes a bar mitzvah, mazel tov. Right? So now as he becomes a bar mitzvah, halacha l'maisa, the Mishnah says that what? The ksuva that he committed to as a katan ultimately still remains in effect. So and I will say, the truth is, it's not a chiddush. Because essentially, what is the Gemara saying? It goes out to ksuva is t'nai bezdin. Ksuva is t'nai bezdin. See, even if you wrote absolutely nothing, you still have a ksuva. So what it's just saying over here is, in this case, he happened to have committed to a ksuva when he was a katan. When he now becomes a gadol and the marriage morphs into an appropriate halachic marriage, the ksuva obligation is still there. So the Gemara says, similarly, ger shekasav ger sheniskaira ishto imo. This is a very interesting case. Let's say you have a Gentile, right? A guy married to a Goya, right? A male Gentile married to a female Gentile. And now what happens? When they are both in their Gentile kite, so husband promises his wife a ksuva. Now, what does that mean, husband promises his wife a ksuva? Essentially, what he's agreeing on is a divorce or widowhood settlement when they first get married, right? A prenup, right? So we'll say, so he committed to this, and now what happens? They convert. So now what's the halacha? The ksuva that he committed to in his Gentile kite ultimately, again, still remains in effect even when they become Jewish. Fascinating. So the Gemara says, Shalmanas kin kaima, Amravuna, lo shana elam manamasayin. Refuah says, by the way, this only refers to Iker Ksuva. However, about Tosefes, ain't law. I would say, but Tosefes does not carry over. So in other words, what that means is, if a katan, when he got married, promised his wife Tosefes, or a guy promised his wife Tosefes, when the katan becomes a gadol, or the guy converts, the Tosefes doesn't carry over. So if they want to commit themselves to Tosefes, what do they have to do? Recommit at bar mitzvah or recommit upon conversion. Rabbi Yehuda Amar Afil Tosefes Yeshla. Rabbi this is not true. Even Tosefes remains in effect. So Meisvei, the Gemara says Chidshu, no tell us Masha Chidshu. So we'll say ultimately Rashi says Chidshu is katan mishehigdil the gershim and iskayer. So Chidshu means if the katan when he became a gadol added on to the ksuva amount, or the guy when he converted added on whatever, right? Chidshu no tells masha chidshu. Chidshu in lo chidshu lo. What do you see from here? It's only if they add on at the time of bar mitzvah or conversion that the add-on amount remains. However, again, even if they added on when he was a katan or they added on when he was a guy, it does not carry over. To which the Gemara says, Ema af mashechidshu. Say even what they added on carries over. I v'halo tani hachi, but it doesn't say that. V'halo tani hachi chidshu, no tals mashechidshu, lo chidshu, besula govim asayim v'amona mona, tiyufta de Rabbi Yehuda. So we'll say ultimately again we effectively refute the position of Rabbi Yehuda that the ruling of the Mishnah says that if the katan agreed to a basic ksuva, ikar ksuva, at the time of his marriage as a katan, or the guy agreed to ikar ksuva at the time of his marriage, and now the guy converts, the katan becomes a gadol, the primary ksuva carries over. But if when the katan was a katan, or the guy was a guy, they agreed to tosefes, the tosefes amount does not carry over. So should they want to go ahead and guarantee tosefes, the katan will have to recommit to that at the time he becomes a gadol. the guy will have to recommit to that at the time he becomes a convert. So the Gemara said, by the way, Rav Yehuda Masnisati, Rav Yehuda was just misled by the Mishnah. Who savar ksuva kayemes akula milsakai? He thought that when the Mishnah said that ksuva kayemes, that the ksuva that the katan agreed to, the ksuva that the guy agreed to, when he becomes a gadol, when he converts, remains intact. Rabbi Yehuda thought that referred to akula milsakai. He thought that referred ultimately again to the entire ksuva, according to Tosefes Velohi, and it was not true. Ikar ksuva kai. Ultimately again, it only refers to the ikar ksuva. And I will say, I'll tell you, so the way the Rambam codifies this halacha is quite interesting. The Rambam says, Katan afilu bent is his hilchos ishus parakirah halacha zayin. Katan afilu bent heishon yom echash nasi isha in laksuva. So we'll say, the Rambam paskins, when a katan marries a woman, there is no ksuva. Now, why is there no ksuva? Why is there no ksuva? Because there's no marriage. Right? But halacha lamaisa, v'im higdil v'kaima achar shigdil yeshla ikir ksuva. If he becomes an adult and then remains married to her, then there is a ksuva. Now I will say, there's a ksuva even if he does what? He does nothing. Why? Because I will say, ksuva is a Tanai Bezdin. Tanai Bezdin says you owe it even if you don't commit to it. So what the Rambam is essentially saying is this case is like a little bit of a misnomer. In other words, that when a katan commits to a ksuva, when he gets married, right, and he's a katan, just like the marriage is not binding, his commitment to a ksuva is not binding. The chiddush of the Mishnah is, if the katan remains married to this woman as a gadol, so once he becomes a gadol, this morphs into a marriage, right? A guy is married to a woman and they convert together and they remain together, ultimately it morphs into a marriage. The chiddush is, the moment marriage morphs into a halachically recognizable marriage, the Tanai Ksuva sets in, even if the husband never actively committed himself to Ksuva. Now, of course, what does that apply to? Iker Ksuva. What doesn't it apply to? Tosefes Ksuva. Tosefes, if he wants to commit, he has to knowingly opt in. Hadralach akol sev lishtavosai mazel tov misha yanasa ishtei nashim umeis. Harishona umeis. Sorry. Let's say, watch this. So Ruvain was married to Rachel and Leah. What happens? Now Ruvain dies. So we'll say, what's the shaila? We have an inheritance shaila. So umeis. Harishona kodemes l'shniya. V'yosh harishona kodemes l'yosh shniya. So we'll say Ruvain is married to Rachel and Leah. Ruvain dies. So we'll say in this case, Rachel and her descendants, right, have first rights in her ksuva, right, and ksuvas benin dichrin as well. Right, go say ksuvas benin dichrin. We're going to come back to that again. That's the clause that a husband writes in his wife's ksuva, that her children that she has with him will inherit her ksuva independent of any other Yerusha considerations. So in this case, Reuven is married to Rachel and Leah. Reuven dies. Rachel gets to collect her ksuva before Leah. And I will say, I want to point out, we're going to touch on this. It's actually something very interesting, which is, in a case where the husband dies, there's multiple things that's happening over here, right? So Reuven dies. The first order of business is ksuva distribution. Right? After ksuva distribution, then what? Then we have estate distribution. Right? So we're going to see there's going to be sometimes a little bit of a clash between those things. So here, Reuven is married to Rachel and Leah, so Reuven dies. Rachel and her descendants get to collect her ksuva before Leah and her descendants get to collect her ksuva. Good. Next case. Nasa Sarishona Umesa, Nasa Shnio Mesu, was well at the following case. Reuven married Rachel, and Rachel died. So now we'll say, leaving behind children. Then Reuven married Leah, right? Umesu, and then Reuven dies. So we'll say, so what's the halacha in this case? So just to find out what you have going on over here. So now I have the descendants of Rachel who want their mother's ksuva, and ultimately again Leah, who is the wife who's still alive, who wants her ksuva. So what's the halacha? Shniya v'yarsheh kolmin liyarsheh rishona. In this case, I will say Leah and her descendants take precedence over Rachel's dead, but Rachel's descendants. Now, what's the pshat with this? If you look at Rashi, it's very interesting. Shniya v'yarsheh kolmin shehi ba'alas chov aval rishona ba liyaresh avien. Because I will say Leah, who is still alive, the second wife who's still alive, she is looked at as a creditor, versus Rachel's descendants are looked at as inheritors, Yarshim. They both say, creditors always have a first position over inheritors. So therefore, interestingly enough, Leah, who is a creditor, the living wife, the widow, is a creditor legabi her ksuva, and therefore halacha l'maisa, she'll have a first position over Rachel's descendants, who are inheritors. Fascinating. So midiktani harishana kodemes l'shniya. So it's the fact that it says the first wife, right? The first wife ultimately, this is going back to the first case, that the first wife ultimately takes precedence over the second one. V'lo katani harishona yeshla v'ashniya einla. And it doesn't say the first wife has and the second wife doesn't. So this is talking about the case, ultimately Reuven's married to Rachel and Leah, and now what? Reuven dies. So what's the halacha? So Rachel has first rights over Leah. So the Gemara just points out over here, the fact that it says, that it does not say, the first wife Rachel has and the second wife doesn't, teaches us that what? Michlal di ikadma shniya v'tafsa lo mafkinon mina. So it teaches us that what? Let's say Leah was a bit more aggressive than Rachel. So what happens? After Reuven dies, Leah seizes property from the estate to satisfy her ksuva. So what do we see from here? So ultimately it teaches us that we would not extract the property from Leah. That as much as Leah did something incorrect, she seized property really before it was owed to her, and before she was in line to collect. Halacha so we wouldn't extract it. What do we see from here? Shmamina ba'chov mu'ocher shekanim v'gava mashegava gava. So we'll say you see from here a very interesting principle, which is in general. Let's say I owe multiple people money, and let's say Reuven has a debt which precedes Shimon. So really, the order of payment is the earlier the debt, the order of payment. Let's say Shimon cuts the line, seizes his assets in order to satisfy his debt, even though his debt is later than Reuven's. Seems to be based on this Mishnah that what? If he seizes it, he seizes it. Says not necessarily. Olam imelacha mashegava lo gava. Not necessarily. Halacha l'maisa will say, if you're a creditor and you skip the line, and you seize assets earlier than you're due, than you're entitled to, halacha l'maisa, we will extract it from you. My kodemes legamre. So we'll say, no. What ultimately, makodemes legamre katani. When the Mishnah says, so we'll say, in this case where Reuven is married to Rachel and Leah, and Reuven dies, and the Mishnah says that Rachel comes before Leah, what does that mean? Legamre. And we'll say legamre means that even if there's only enough money in the estate to pay off Rachel's ksuva, and after we pay off Rachel's ksuva, then what? There's nothing left for Leah, we still pay off Rachel's ksuva, and we don't say, well, you know what? There's not enough for both of them, let's divide a little bit more equitably. No, not true. Kodem means Rachel has kedimu, she has precedence, her ksuva is paid off, even if that means there's not a penny left in the estate for anything else. Kivisnan, as we learned, ben kodem labas. I will say, just like when the Mishnah used lashon of ben kodem labas, a son comes before a daughter. What does it mean a son comes before a daughter? That a son inherits. And even with the inheritance of the son, if there's nothing left for the daughter, so you see the lashon of kodem means someone has precedence to the point that even if there's nothing left for the other parties, halacha l'maisa, we still distribute. Ikadami, others are also an alternate version of this. Ikadami with lo katani im kadma shniya v'tafsa imotzi miyada, since it doesn't say in the Mishnah that if the second one came along, meaning Leah, second wife, came along and seized property for her ksuva, we don't extract it from her hands. Michlal di kadma shniya v'tafsa mafkinar mina. Sounds like from here that if Leah were to come along in halacha l'maisa, seize property, we would extract it from her. Shmamina, we learned from here. Bachov she mu'uchar shekadam v'gava mashegava lo gava. Sounds like from here that if you have a creditor, a later position creditor, who comes out of turn and seizes property, so ultimately we will extract that which he took, to which the Gemara says, no, mashegava gava. Maybe not. We'll say just an alternate version of the previous conversation. Maybe we'll say in general, even if you seize out of turn, whatever you took, you took. The Gemara says, but nevertheless, but since we said that ultimately, later on in the Mishnah, the second wife and her inheritors come before the inheritors of the first wife, therefore on the days, we use the same lashon ultimately again of Rishona Kodemas Lishnia. Good. So we'll say two different versions. We're going to see, I will say, that the halacha ultimately is really going to side with the first version. Namely that halacha l'maisa, when the Mishnah says, Reuven's married to Rachel and Leah. Right? Now Reuven dies. Who has first rights of collection for a ksuva? Rachel. And we're going to see that is true even if halacha l'maisa, it leaves very little for any type of collection for the rest of the estate. Rachel's rights really come before anything else. Again, we'll see that a little bit clearer later on. So Nasa Sarishona, so I will say, so now we come to the second case in the Mishnah. Right? So second case in the Mishnah was, here we go. Reuven marries Rachel, and then what happens? Rachel dies. Rachel dies, Umesa. Now I will say, now I want to point out, what happens when Rachel dies? What happens when Rachel dies? So Reuven, her husband, inherits her. Now remember, the piece that's still outstanding over here is what? Kesuvos ben Dichrin. Right? So ultimately, remember again, Rachel's children, Rachel's sons, have the halachic right to inherit her ksuba. Okay? Now what happens? So now Reuven marries a second wife, Leah, and what happens? Now he predeceases Leah. He passes away. So then I both say, so now, who's in line? Who's in line? Of course, after the Levaya. Right? But who's in line to collect? Right? We've got Rachel's sons and Leah. And Leah, right? Leah's the widow. Right? So Leah wants her ksuva. Rachel's sons want their mother's ksuva. So in this case, what's the halacha? Shniya v'yarshechem l'yarsheh. In this case, you're both saying, Leah, the second wife, takes precedence over the inheritors of Rachel, the first wife. Why? So Rashi said why? Because Leah is what? Leah is what? Leah is a creditor. Leah is a creditor versus Rachel's descendants who are inheritors. And apparently what the Mishnah is teaching me is that creditors take precedence over inheritors. Okay, says the Gemara. So Shmamina plus. We learned from here three things. Number one, Shmamina achas b'chai v'achas b'moso yesh lem kesuvos ben dichrin. This is interesting. What you see from here is something very interesting, which is that the children of the first wife have kesuvos ben dichrin, which is interesting, right? So children of the first wife have. So in other words, that kesuvos ben dichrin applies even if the father remarried. Now, well, why I would think otherwise, we'll see. But Allah, right? So in other words, kesuvos ben dichrin applies even to the yarshim of the first wife, right? And we're not concerned about any type of conflict within the family. Now, from where do we see this? Midiktani shniya v'yarsheha kol min liyarshe rishona. Rabbi say from the fact that the Mishnah says, in this case that we just learned, that who takes precedence? Leah and her Yarshim take precedence over the descendants of Rachel, the Yarshim of Rachel. What do you see from here? So Miktam hu dekadmi. We see that Leah takes precedence over Rachel's kids. Ha'ika shakli. But we see that Rachel's children are still what? Entitled to kesuvos ben dichrin. So we'll say, so that's halach number one that we see. That kesuvos ben dichrin applies even if husband-father has remarried, right? Ultimately, again, the children of the first wife still have the claim of kesuvos ben dichrin. Good. That's halach number one. Shmamina, ksuva na'asis mosa lechaverta. So we'll say, this is very interesting. What we also see is like this. So we'll say, in general, the Gemara is operating on a principle. The principle is that the only time that you're obligated to pay out kesuvos ben dichrin is when there's going to be something left in the estate after you pay out that ksuba. But if essentially payment of the kesuvos ben dichrin, not regular ksuba, kesuvos ben dichrin is gonna wipe out the estate, there's no din of kesuvos ben dichrin. Essentially, we'll say, now why is that? To frame that a little bit differently, kesuvos ben dichrin is what type of takana? A dirabanan. Yerusha is d'oraisa. So if the kesuvos ben dichrin is going to obviate the Yerusha, right, is going to totally undermine Yerusha, which is the d'oraisa, then no, we don't do that. So it's a fascinating halacha. Now, how much has to be left in the estate after kesuvos ben dichrin? Even a dinar. So in other words, minimal amount. But the point is, there has to be something left in the estate after the payment of kesuvos ben dichrin in order to pay kesuvos ben dichrin. Otherwise, we say no. The din of Yerusha trumps the din of kesuvos ben dichrin. Such a fascinating halacha. So we'll say, so what do you see from here? So we'll say, you see from here that ksuva na'asis mosa lechaverta. So we'll say, now watch this. So what we will say is that halacha l'maisa, that the ksuva, in other words, the ksuva itself can count as the residual amount in the estate. In other words, that even though, let's say I have enough money to pay out the two ksuvas, and when I pay out those two ksuvas, what's going to happen? There's nothing left. Halacha l'maisa, when I pay out the first ksuva, the second amount, which I know is going to go towards the second ksuva, can still count as the residual amount in the estate, so as to allow for the distribution. We'll see this play out in the Gemara in just a moment. How do you know this? How do you know this? Because the Mishnah doesn't say that there needs to be a mosar dinar in addition to what? In addition to the two ksuva payments. So you see from here that Allah Maisa, the second ksuva payment itself could be looked at as the mosar, as the additional amount for the first, and the first can be looked at as the mosar dinar ultimately for the second. And halacha number 3, ushmamina ksuvas ben dichrin lo tarfa mishabdi. I will say furthermore, the third thing you learn is what I will say, that ksuvas ben dichrin cannot be paid from encumbered properties. Also, which means that what? That for payment of ksuvas ben dichrin, you can only pay it out from what? Property that the estate owns. But if, let's say again, Ruvain sold off property, the Yarshim don't have the right to what? To go to Lakuchos, to go to purchasers and claw back property to pay the ksuvas benin dichrin. I will say, I want to point out, that's fundamentally different than what? Regular ksuva. Right, regular ksuva, if Ruvain went ahead and sold off his entire estate, and now Ruvain dies or is divorced, Rachel has the right to claw back property to pay for a ksuva. That is dafka a din in ksuva, not a din in ksuvas benin dichrin. So ksuvas benin dichrin, if the estate has the money, great. If the estate doesn't have the money, no clawback. No clawback. So the Gemara says, why? How do you know? Because ultimately, again, if you think that you can go ahead and claw back encumbered properties, leisu b'nei rishona, v'litrafinu libnei shniya. So we'll say, if that's the case, then ultimately, we'll say in our case over here, where Rachel has the ability, Leah has, wife number 2, collects her ksuva first. Well, if that's the case, there's nothing left in the estate, let the Yarshim of Rachel go ahead and what? Seize property from Leah, because now there's nothing left for them. Nothing left for them. To which the Gemara says, Maskif Ravashi, Mimai, how do you know this? Dilma, the Olam Eimalacha, first wide line, the Olam Eimalacha, Achas Bechai Achas B'moso, Eilen Ksuvas Ben Dichrin. So let's go back to the first assertion. The first assertion was that Halacha L'maisa, when Reuven dies, Rachel dies, Reuven's married to Rachel dies, and now Reuven marries Leah. So Halacha L'maisa will say, the Gemara says that there is still Ksuvas Ben Dichrin for Rachel's children, for Rachel's Yarshim. To which the Gemara says, how do you know that? So maybe not. Maybe once Reuven gets married, halacha l'maisa again, there's no longer a ksuvas ben dichrin for the children of the first marriage. So the Gemara says, umay kodmin. What does it mean ultimately again, kodmin? That Rachel comes first. That Leah, the second wife, comes first. Maybe l'nachala, right? Maybe I will say what it means is that the ksuva of Leah, the second wife, comes before any other inheritance considerations. Maybe that's what it means. The Gemara says, Yarshe Harishona Lamali. If that's the case, then why do you have to bring in Yarshe Harishona, the inheritors of the first wife Rachel? Why do they even have to be brought in at all? To which the Gemara says, Aidi the Tana Shnia v'Yarsha, Tana Nami the Yarshe Harishona. Ultimately, I will say, since it ultimately mentioned Shnia v'Yarsha, the second wife, and her inheritors, will also mention the first wife and her inheritors. Okay, so if I will say, the Gemara just says, remember, the first thing the Gemara said we learn is that Ksuvas Ben Dichrin even applies to the Yarshim of the first wife, even after Reuven has married a second wife. To which the Gemara says, maybe not. Maybe not. That's all. So in other words, we're not saying no, but we're just saying the proof that you sought to bring is not as conclusive as you thought. Next, that which you said, Abba said that a ksuva ultimately again could count as the residual estate amount in order to allow the payout of the other ksuva. Maybe not. And I will say ultimately again, maybe this is a case where really there is a residual dinar in the estate. That's how halacha l'maisa you can pay out the ksuvas ben dichrin. And lastly, va'achos b'chai va'achos b'moso. So I'm sorry. So now we're going back. So now the Gemara says, by the way, achos b'chai va'achos b'moso tanahi. In reality, Rabbi say this idea of achos b'chai and achos b'moso. So we're not going to be able to go into this too much longer. But I'll just mention this outside. It was like this concept of where Reuven is married to Rachel, and then ultimately again, what happens? Reuven dies. Reuven is married to Rachel, and then what happens? Rachel dies. Now Reuven goes ahead and marries Leah, and now Reuven dies. So now remember again, what are the two claims coming at Reuven's estate? We've got Leah claiming her ksuva, and we've got the kids of Rachel claiming what? Ksuvas benin dichrin. So the Gemara says, you see from here that the claim of Ksuvas benin dichrin carries over even into Reuven's second marriage. So the Gemara says, just want to point out that concept, the achas b'chai v'achas b'moso tenoihi. That ultimately is a machlokes tanoim. Not everybody agrees with this. We'll say just quickly, we'll do one more line. To Sanyo, mesu achas b'chai v'achas b'moso. Benanas omi yicholim b'nei harishon alomar v'b'nei hashniya b'nei balas chov atem tlu ksuvas imchem utsu'u. So Benana says in this case, ultimately again, the children of the first wife, Rachel, could say to the children of the second wife, which really means Talia herself, listen, take your ksuva and get out. Listen, take your ksuva and get out. You get your mother, fine. Your mother take your ksuva, but then we are entitled to our ksuva spin and dichron. Rabbi Akiva Omer, kvar kofza nachalam lefnei b'nei harishona v'nafla lefnei b'nei hashniya. Rabbi Akiva says, no, not true. Once Reuven gets married, ultimately again, the children of the first wife lost, ultimately their ksuvas benin dichron. What are they arguing about? One holds that ultimately again, even when Reuven remarries, children from the first marriage still have ksuvas benin dichron. Umar savar achas b'chayi v'achas b'mosa in ksuvas benin dichron, and one holds that no, ultimately again there is no longer ksuvas benin dichron once Reuven marries. Okay, so start for today. Point of.
6:35.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, for sure.
Okay. Why does no one tell me that? You see, I'm running. Look at me suffer through this. Okay, good. That's like incredible. Okay, fine. Good. All right. So good. We'll say, here we go. We're going to get into tomorrow's daf. Incredible. So we'll say, so says the Gemara. So we'll say, so that's the machlokes. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam shakol niyeh b'dvaro. Okay. Says the Gemara. Amar Rabba. Ashkechetinu l'Rabbanan debei Rav. So we'll say, so this is the machlokes. Here we go. So this is the machlokes, Rabbi Akiva and Benanas. Namely again, about say halacha l'maisa. It's like a new lease on life. Right? So we'll say, so halacha l'maisa. Now, what happens? Again, just to frame, we're dealing in the same case, right? Reuven is married to Rachel. Ultimately, again, Rachel dies. Now, we'll say at that point, this ksuvas benin dichron, which means Reuven is obligated to go ahead and pay off the ksuva of Rachel to Rachel's heirs. Okay, he doesn't. He marries Leah. Now he dies. So we'll say the fundamental machlok. So again, everybody's agreeing. We'll say, what does everybody agree on? Everybody agrees the order of repayment is what? The order of repayment ultimately again is first go to Leah, right? Because she is a creditor, and then to Rachel's heirs. Now, the whole notion of paying Rachel's heirs is in and of itself a machlokes. Does ksuvas benin dichron apply once Reuven has entered into a second marriage and now has a second set of obligations? That's the machlokes. Benanas ultimately says yes. Rabbi Akiva says no. So Amar Rabba, Ashkechesina l'Rabbanan de'Rab Yasivika Amri. So Rabbi says, I found the Rabbanan be'Rab. They were sitting and saying the following: Chuli Alma Achas b'Chai v'Achas Mosa Yeshlan Ksuvas benin dichron. Everyone agrees that Ksuvas benin dichron still applies to Rachel's heirs, to the first marriage heirs. Everyone agrees. Here's what's interesting. So what they're really arguing about is as follows. That halacha l'maisa, remember again, in order to have an obligation to pay out ksuva, what has to happen? There has to be a residual amount that's left in the estate. So what's the shaila? Could a ksuva count as the residual amount? So you have two ksuva payments to pay over here, right? You have the ksuva to Leah, right? Just straight ksuva, and ksuva has been in dichrin to Rachel's heirs. So the shaila is, could a ksuva amount count as the residual within the estate in order to allow for payment of the ksuva? Because also remember again, let's just go back to our principle. What's our principle? There's only going to be a ksuva has been in dichrin payment. If what? If halacha l'maisa there's something left in the estate after ksuvas benin dichrin is paid, because if payment of ksuvas benin dichrin cleans out the estate, then what ends up happening is the din d'Rabbanan undermines the din d'Oraisa of Yerusha. So the question is, can the ksuva amount count as the residual? So Mar Savar, ksuva nasis most lechaverta, for din lebachov. So we'll say one says, yes, it works for ksuva, and it also works for balchov. In other words, we'll say that halacha l'maisa, that any amount that you owe to another creditor, when that amount is in the estate itself, even though I know I'm going to have to pay it out, it still counts as residual. Still counts as residual. The Umar Savar, the other opinion holds that what? Ksuva nasis most of the chaverta. Sorry, Umar Savar in ksuva nasis most of the chaverta for din lebachov. Another opinion says no. I will say what counts as residual? What counts as residual? Unencumbered monies. They both say it's such a fascinating idea. In other words, everyone agrees. So I will say let's go with what everyone agrees with. Right? Let's start with that. What does everyone agree with? At least at this stage of the Gemara, everyone agrees that the din of ksuvas ben indichrin never goes away. So therefore, even though Reuven remarried, and he married Leah now, and now he dies, the din of Kesuvos ben indichrin to Rachel's heirs is still there. Everyone is agreeing on that. We will say, what else is everyone agreeing on? That Kesuvos ben indichrin is only paid out when? When there's a residual in the estate. There's got to be something left in the estate. So this is fascinating. What's the machlokes? What counts as something? Is it only something if it's unencumbered monies? Or no, even if it's encumbered monies. Let's say there's something left in the estate, but I happen to know everything left in the estate is already what? Earmarked for something else. This has to get paid to a ksuva, this has to get paid to a creditor. So there's stuff left, so after you pay out the ksuvas ben indichrin, there's stuff left in the estate, but it's earmarked, but it's going out. It's going out. It's not earmarked, what's the word? It's allocated. It's allocated, right? It's allocated for something else. It's allocated. So Lamaisa, again, one opinion holds that's still called residual. The other opinion holds, no, that's not called residual. What's the definition of residual? What's residual? Residual is unencumbered funds that are left in the estate. Fascinating. So the Gemara says, Va'amilu, and I said to them, I said to them, everyone agrees that if there's money left in the estate, even if it's earmarked for creditors, that's still called residual. Ki pligi b'ksuva. Where's the machlokes? We'll say if there's additional monies left in the estate, and ultimately, again, it's allocated for ksuva. Is that amount called residual or not? So, miskabel Rav Yosef. So Rav Yosef raises the kasha. Ihaki Rabbi Akiva Omer Kvar Kafza Nachala Im Yesh Moser Dinari Baile. If that's the case, then why does Rabbi Akiva say that there's no ksuvas ben indichrin? Rabbi Akiva should just simply say, as long as there is Moser Dinar, as long as there is some residual, that's an unencumbered residual in the estate, you should pay out the ksuvas ben indichrin on the first marriage. Ela Omer Rav Yosef. Let's say we're back to square one. No, you're right. The concept of say whether or not there's ksuvas ben indichrin, once there is a second marriage, that is the source of machlokes. That in and of itself. So again, Reuven is married to Rachel, right? Rachel dies. He now marries Leah. He dies. So we'll say, so now again, Rachel's yarshim, Rachel's heirs are coming, demanding the ksuva of their mother. Is there ksuvas ben indichrin in such a situation like that? That's the machlokes. Rabbi Akiva says no, Benanis says yes. So it says the Gemara, Vahani tanoi, ki ani tanoi. And I will say, this machlokes sounds like another machlokes tanoi. This sanya, nos es harishona umeisa. Right? If he went ahead and he married, right, Reuven married Rachel and Rachel died, Nasas Hashniya Umeishu, and then he married Leah and Reuven died. So what's the halacha? Bo'in baneh shalzu la'achar nisa v'noklim ksuva siman. So we'll say now again. The Gemara says over here, the yarshim of Rachel come and take the ksuva of their mother. Rabbi Shimon says, Im yesh mosar dinar elu noklim ksuvas iman ve'elu noklim ksuvas the iman. Rabbi Shimon says, as long as there's a residual of a dinar in the estate, everyone can take the ksuba of their mother. Ve'im lav cholkin b'shaveh. But if not, Avraham says incredible. If there's not the residual dinar, then what? No one gets the ksuba, and ultimately, again, they split everything evenly. My love b'hakim. If you see, other not argument the following case. The mar savar achas b'chai v'achas b'mosa yesh lan ksuvas ben indichrin, or mar savar achas b'chai v'achas b'mosa iman ksuvas ben indichrin. So that's they're arguing about. Is there ksuvas ben indichrin? Once there's a second marriage, where it says lo. We'll say everyone agrees. Again, we're back to where we were. Everyone agrees. We'll say that Kesuvos ben indichrin always applies, even when Reuven marries Leah, even though it's a second marriage. So now the children of Rachel who passed away still have the din of Kesuvos ben indichrin. Top of Tzadik Aleph, V'acha b'dinar mikar koi kamiflagi. I will say, here's what's interesting. Okay, and with this we'll conclude. I will say, see here, so okay, good news. We don't have a conclusion. We have a conclusion for now. Halacha l'maisa, everyone is agreeing that Kesuvos ben Dichrin from Rachel doesn't go away when Reuven marries Leah. And therefore, when Reuven dies, the children of Rachel have a right to demand their mother's ksuva. What else does everyone agree with? That you need a residual in the estate in order to collect Kesuvos ben Dichrin. So what's the machlokes? Bedina mikar koi kamiflagi. Marsara mikar koi im taltali lo, or marsara im taltali. So what's the machlokes? When we talk about the one dinar residual, does that have to be a one dinar residual of real property or even movable property? That's the machlokes, right? We'll have the shkach of the stuff we'll for today. So again, we haven't really gotten to the conclusion yet. And Mirat Hashem, during the break, during tomorrow, during Yom Kippur, Mirat Hashem, we'll finish the sugya. We'll get to halacha l'maisa. Shkoyach.